It is such an honor to welcome you here, to see so many people coming to celebrate and honor the hard work that we do. This conference has migrated between Harvard and Boston University ever since it was founded by Mark Kramer, the incomparable Mark Kramer, and we are so honored to have you here on what is essentially hallowed ground in our field. And that is because it was here that Tony Lucas, J. Anthony Lucas, taught and researched and wrote his masterpiece, Common Ground. It was right here that he did this about a quarter century ago. So this is indeed a special place for us to be discussing and honoring and considering all that we do. This narrative nonfiction conference is in some ways, if it were a play, it would have an all-star cast. Thanks to the people who have agreed to come and talk with us about the work that they do to inspire us to continue doing what we do. It's been titled The Rebirth of Storytelling because in some ways the last few years have been just that. There's been many, many challenges to the work that we do, but at the same time, much to be cheerful and optimistic about, because as the world changes, so has narrative. Narrative isn't so much a part of what we are as human beings. 2010 was especially a good year for narrative nonfiction. From David Remnick's The Bridge to Hampton Sides' Hellhound on His Trail, to a beautiful history to the art form, the ethereal art of ballet, to a portrait of Mickey Mantle, to 60s rockers portrait and ode to her friend, Robert Mapplethorpe, and to the era in which they inhabited. All of these things are indication of the wide range of possibilities of narrative nonfiction, and that's just in the printed word. Is there an audience for narrative nonfiction for what we do? We'll be exploring that. Why is it that we do what we do, and what does it take out of us? What do we have to give of ourselves in order to pursue this work? So the question about whether there's an audience, we'll be discussing that very shortly. But one of the indications that there is such an audience is that Amazon.com, the online purveyor of now cultural role in our society, chose, every year it actually chooses the 100 best books of the year, as do so many other publications. But Amazon is the new kid on the block, and so it's interesting to see what happens when they choose it. And in the top five books out of the 300,000 that they sell, they happen to have chosen three works of narrative nonfiction, three. In a world in which it's generally dominated by fiction, here you have three works that took years and years to complete, are based on fact, based on the hard research and work that has to go into it, and emerged as considered by Amazon to be the best books of the year. That is astounding. That is truly astounding. And it's my honor and shock, actually, to see mine as one of them as number 5. So that was an honor. But getting to the point of what the reality of narrative nonfiction may be for all of us in various forms of this work, I was so inspired by just a few days ago. This is how natural and embedded this should be in our work, is that just a few days ago, the New York Times ran a lovely piece by Dan Barry, and it was about a 58-year-old man in Central Florida who has taken up and maintained the ritual, decades-long ritual through a divorce and all these other things that actually called in question in the small town as whether he was fit to do it, and still portrays Jesus, actually, on the cross in a passion play that he recreates every year in his small town. And that people come out by the thousands in order to see this. And this was a narrative, told truly in the narrative, beginning in medias res, at the moment just before they were to go on stage, and they were still spray painting the people who would be in it. They were spray painted to look as they perceived a Middle Easterner would look. So they were spray painted red, essentially, to look like painfully sunburnt people. And all of these details are what made it so rich. And that brings us to our opening keynote speaker. What an honor to have Jill Abramson with us. Jill Abramson is the managing editor of the New York Times. She is one of the most influential people in journalism, period. She has had such a rich and varied career herself. She spent many years at the Wall Street Journal. And in 1997, after 10 years at the Wall Street Journal, she joined the New York Times and specialized in long-form investigative pieces, narratives I might add, about the role of money in politics. And in 2000, she became the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, where she was named bureau chief. When she was named bureau chief, she became the first woman to hold that post. She, in 2003, moved to New York to become the managing editor of the New York Times. And that means that she runs the New York Times newsroom and decides what will go on page one, helps decide what will go on page one for the world to see. She also is an accomplished and acclaimed author herself in narrative nonfiction. She co-wrote with Jane Mayer, the New Yorker writer, the seminal book, Strange Justice, about the case of Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. And she also has entered the online world as a blogger herself. She has blogged about one of the most important aspects of a human being's life, and that is their relationship to their dog. Very dear to my heart. She has written about the life of her puppy, Scout, and that is a literary allusion, as we all know, to Kill a Mockingbird. So there's literature everywhere. And she is now converting that into a book, which will be called The Puppy Diaries, which we should all be looking for later in the year. I love the title. We are so honored to have Jill Abramson with us. Welcome, Jill Abramson. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for getting up so early. We are here sharing our passion for this kind of work, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be with you talking about narrative journalism, its traditions, as well as what I certainly believe is its very robust future. And part of the reason I'm so optimistic about the future of narrative nonfiction is because it couldn't have a better protector and champion than my friend Isabel Wilkerson, who represents everything that's essential and vibrant about nonfiction narrative. In preparing this talk, I realized that I run the risk of sounding like I'm pandering a bit, because part of what I plan to say here involves some of the participants in this conference. But in order to explain the source of my confidence in the future of this medium, it's impossible not to do a fair amount of talking first about Isabel herself. As the Times' Chicago bureau chief, I know all of you know she won a Pulitzer Prize in 1994, in part for her searing portrait of a 10-year-old boy, Nicholas Whitaker, and the hard job he was doing of growing up in the Englewood section of Chicago, where he was called upon, as Isabel wrote, to be nanny, referee, housekeeper, and handyman. I did not yet work at the Times when I read Isabel's story, but I will always remember the singular image of Nicholas that Isabel painted at the top of her story, washing the next day's school clothes for his brothers and sisters in the bathtub. All of these years later, that detail is still indelible, not because I saw it in a video clip, but because of the power of the words Isabel used to describe it. 11 years later, when she was no longer on staff at the Times and was instead working on her monumental book about the great migration that has defined the history of urban America over the last century, Isabel returned to tell the story of Nicholas's mother, Angela, and her bumpy climb into America's middle class. It was an equally unforgettable portrait that was the last piece in a series that the Times published on the role of class in America. It was more than 8,000 words long, but immediately Isabel's piece had the reader on the edge of his seat as Angela sits down to take the entrance test that would become her ticket into the middle class. She badly wanted to become a registered nurse. And there, at the smack at the top of the piece, is all the narrative tension a reader can stand. Isabel situates Angela. She's walking into the testing room where she's going to take the tests that will define the rest of her life. Will she make it or not? You can hear a time bomb begin ticking. There are plenty of these edge-of-your-seat moments in The Warmth of Other Suns, the book she took 15 years to write. There's that brave but precarious time when George Swanson Starling dares to challenge the ridiculously cheap price he's been offered for his tangerines, the event that triggers his flight from white oppression in Florida. Or when Robert Joseph Pershing Foster is driving across country from Louisiana. He wants to reach Los Angeles, but he's nodding off at the wheel because in between LA and Louisiana, there's literally no place where he is permitted to stop and get a room and get some sleep and spend the night. Those scenes will be etched into my brain for as long as my memory has its chips. This is because the best nonfiction narrative journalism is like a movie in your mind. This kind of journalism, whether in newspapers or magazines, books, is really a unique American art form. And Isabel herself nods to the debt we all owe earlier writers of both fiction and nonfiction in the wonderful title to her book, which comes from a Richard Wright quotation. When did this kind of journalism begin, and what are its unique roots? It's something we really should ask ourselves periodically. And what are its connections to today's dizzying 24-hour 7 news cycle and the role of journalism in the digital age? These are the big questions I've explored as managing editor of the Times, but in another venue too. Because for the past 5 years, I've taught a narrative nonfiction writing seminar each spring term at Yale. Working with some of the most talented young writers of our time is a sometimes daunting but truly thrilling part of my professional life. Part of the satisfaction of teaching for me, obviously, is to attempt to spread my viral enthusiasm for pieces of long and consequential journalism in the New York Times. By the end of the term, just about now in fact, I begin to believe that I've succeeded in convincing the students of the Times' utterly indispensable role in civilized life as we know it. This year, some members of this content must be free generation are even digging out their credit cards to get digital subscriptions. But the biggest thrill isn't opening their eyes to the wonders of the Times. It's seeing them become just as enthralled as I was when I first read it, with John Hersey, who was once the Don of Yale's English department, and getting them addicted to those 6 suspense-filled characters, the atom bomb survivors, who helped introduce the world to new journalism on the pages of The New Yorker, in that August 31st, 1946 issue in which Hiroshima took up the entire editorial space of the issue. Imagine how many clicks you would need to read it today on your laptop or swipes on your iPad. But it's the excitement of introducing my students also to the artistry of Gay Talese's Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. Even when many of them wouldn't recognize, even though many of my students can't recognize the opening bars to In the Wee Small Hours. We're lucky to have Gay with us today. I've launched my class each year with his Sinatra piece, considered by many to be the single finest profile ever written. because it's so instructive about the irreplaceable role of reporting, and then reporting some more, of scooping up every detail you can, and then going back for some more, and of never ever relying on access alone to get the story. We may live in warp speed times, but when a reporter tells me he or she needs more time to go back and get the real story behind the story, I think of Gay and his reporting techniques and the pieces that that kind of reporting produces. And I almost always say yes, because right now, where do you find those kind of pieces, except for in the Times, the New Yorker, and precious few other places? Because I believe this kind of journalism is a distinct American art form, I also ask my students to read Winter Dreams. It's an unforgettable short story. If you haven't read it, go dig it out this very day. It's an unforgettable story about yearning by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Gay once said that this was his favorite story, and that even when he started at the Times, he started as a clerk, but when he was a very young reporter, his ambition as a journalist was to write like Fitzgerald. And I think every really great journalist has another writer in his head when he sits down at the keyboard, though few would actually admit to wanting to be a latter-day Fitzgerald. Only Gay could get away with that. Finally, after they've reported their hearts out, I ask my students, who write 2 long pieces in my class, to outline their stories, to think about how you begin to establish narrative tension and paint scenes in the reader's head, the way Isabel does. I ask them to reread the first scene in Gay's Frank Sinatra profile and to remember Harlan Ellison, a guy in the bar who offends the singer because he isn't dressed properly. He's wearing a pair of game warden boots that cost $60, but to Sinatra, those aren't good enough shoes. They almost come to blows, and in the piece, the tension becomes white hot. I don't want anyone in here without coats or ties, Sinatra snaps, in an era when the tieless Beatles were beginning to become the new cultural pace setters. The day after Gay was trying to be a fly on the wall at the bar, because Sinatra at that point and really throughout the rest of his reporting kind of tantalized Gay by saying, well, maybe he would get an interview, but Gay never actually gets a sit down, at least an on the record sit down that he could use for the story. So in reporting, what Gay did is the very next day after he saw this fight, he was in the bar, this fight unfold, he tracked down Harlan Ellison and asked him if he could come and interview him. Because what Gay wanted to know is how that what Harlan Ellison had seen and heard, but most importantly, what it felt like to him. And it produced like an unforgettable first scene for his piece. And that's what a really good reporter does. And then I show them Gay's outline for the piece. It looks like a movie director's crazy but meticulous notes for shooting every frame of the film. I don't require all my students to have outlines just like this, but a strong piece of nonfiction narrative has to be plotted out this meticulously. By the time they are done studying Gay's profile, some of my students even decide to use the pieces of cardboard. Gay uses shirt boards that come back from the laundry, and then he cuts them up into pieces to take their notes on, because these are the tools of the master. Collecting fly-on-the-wall, detailed reporting, painting scenes, establishing character, injecting some narrative tension into the story, and making journalism as vivid as the best fiction was the essential spirit of the new journalism. Those are really the same essential qualities of the best narrative journalism produced today, whether it's on print or online, and those are the traditions that we try to keep alive in both the printed Times and nytimes.com. Because it turns out, when you think about it, all of those digital doomsayers were wrong. People still love to read, and some of the longest and most challenging pieces in the Times are precisely the ones that zoom up our most popular and our most email lists online, on our website. We published a long magazine piece early last week. It was a book excerpt by Janie Scott about President Obama's mother. The book had its origins in a long profile we had published during the 2008 election, which had developed a devoted following. The excerpt of Janie's book, which we put up on our website Tuesday morning, took exactly 4 minutes to rocket to #1 on the most emailed. Sure, it might have been that adorable picture of the very little President Obama dressed as a pirate with his very young mother that attracted readers, but I'm certain they were compelled to read every word of Janie's piece. There has to be sweet irony in the fact that in 2008, Steve Jobs, Apple's chief executive, was quoted in the Bits technology blog of the Times saying, quote, "It doesn't matter how good or bad the product is. The fact is that people don't read anymore." Of course, that was before Apple's insane first quarter profits this year, fueled in part by sales of more than 7 million of its lovely reading tablet, the iPad. In fact, I had got the iPad too, and I'm already slavishly addicted. It could make me into a hermit. Tablets and iPhones, in fact, have given long-form narrative journalism a way to reach a new audience, and that audience is showing an inclination to pay for the best presentations of that material, whether it comes in magazine apps or in new products like the Atavist, which is an app for long stories, including rich multimedia content, audio narration, links to more information, and casts of characters. But with the swipe of a finger, you can revert to clean text and enjoy the simple joy of quietly reading text. On the iPad, the Atavist app is $2.99, and already more than 40,000 readers have downloaded it. Revenue is then split between the site and the authors of the article. It's a small boutique product, but it's another encouraging indication that the long-form article isn't only alive, it's actually dancing to new music. I spent the last 6 months of 2010 focusing exclusively on the digital landscape at the Times. During my deep digital dive, I visited some of what we call our neo-competitors, like Politico and the Huffington Post, which have drawn large new audiences of readers who are mainly snackers. They're looking for what I call scooplets, short, buzzy stories and blog items about politics and other topical subjects. Sure, it includes gossip, even the royal wedding. But Ariana Huffington has said she wants to feature some longer pieces and even investigative articles. The problem, as many of you know, is that it can take a writer or reporting team months of work to really get to the bottom of a subject. And it's very expensive work to try and produce. You can't do original reporting by scraping the internet. You need, and you really need experience to be able to interview and bring to life the kind of people Isabel Wilkerson knows to bring to life in her narrative nonfiction. So the field in which this kind of reporting and writing is prized and encouraged has become smaller, which is a source of worry for me. It's in areas like investigative reporting, enterprise feature writing, certain foreign, and certainly also in foreign and international reporting that you've seen a very disturbing retreat, especially by other daily papers, the kind of regional papers that were very high quality and used to routinely win Pulitzer Prizes for long pieces. It's just to keep a full staff, to keep an investigative unit together, it is expensive, and in an era of constant cost cutting, it's terrible but true that these very high-end areas is where the cuts seem to have fallen in the deepest way. Yeah. Ken Auletta recently interviewed me for a piece he was writing about the new editor of the Wall Street Journal, where I had spent nearly 10 years of my career and learned more about the art of long nonfiction reporting and writing than I had anywhere else in my career. While that news organization still produces much work that is urgent and admirable, I deeply miss those long takeouts that used to dominate the front page, which were written so beautifully and reported so exhaustively and really edited so expertly. They were always my favorite pieces to read and to work on because they were the story behind the story, which often interests me more than the news itself. The current journal, I told Ken, rarely has these pieces, the ones you carried home with you because you needed more time to read and absorb them. The new journal at its core is a quick delivery system. It's excellent. It gives you, a good review of the news. It still has plenty of compelling original reporting, but those long, distinctive pieces are mostly gone, and that makes me very sad indeed. So where have they gone? If other newspapers have retreated, they still are vibrant in many magazines, including The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, other places. But there are new places too. ProPublica, for instance, has a different business model altogether. It's set up as a nonprofit, and it is an outfit based in New York that employs about 30 investigative reporters who exclusively work on long-form projects, some of which are narratives. The Times published about a year ago, and in fact we won a Pulitzer for it, a piece that was written by Sherry Fink, who is on the staff of ProPublica. She's an MD. She had actually worked on this piece, which was about euthanasia during Hurricane Katrina at one of the hospitals in New Orleans. She'd worked on it for years and brought that project after having a fellowship to ProPublica, and ProPublica approached the Times, would we want to publish the piece? Sherry hadn't finished reporting it. It was the kind of reporting that we on our own couldn't have gotten, and we were very happy to essentially do a co-production with ProPublica, and the piece was published very, very long, but totally gripping in our magazine. But, ProPublica employs some of the colleagues that I knew as investigative reporters when they were at other papers, and they're doing amazing work. This year they won both a Polk Award for enterprise work in education and another Pulitzer. They won the Pulitzer for investigative reporting this year. So there's hope as I worry and fret over retreat in certain places. There are new flowers blooming all over the place. So that keeps me optimistic. We're told, in fact, that younger readers don't have the patience to read long stories. And yet the recent story I've heard the most about from both my students, from younger colleagues at the Times, and from other people is Larry Wright's recent takeout in The New Yorker about Paul Haggis and the Church of Scientology, which was really almost Hersey-esque in length, but almost impossible to put down. And it seems that on the web, every month brings new cool sites and features for reading long-form narrative nonfiction journalism. I recently downloaded Jon Krakauer's critique of Greg Mortenson's Charity. The piece was called 3 Cups of Deceit on a site called byliner.com, which is using an ebook model. It's charging $2.99 for its premium menu of articles. A service called Long Reads has existed since April 2009, and over 7,000 people follow this account to get between 3 to 5 long article recommendations a day from various publications around the web. Mark Armstrong, the founder of this project, believes that, quote, The long reads community is growing as people continue to look for material that's perfect for their iPhone, Kindle, and iPad. And these devices are changing the way people write for the web. It's no longer just about short, snackable blog posts consumed at work when the boss isn't looking. It's also now about immersive, in-depth storytelling for people to enjoy during commutes, airplane flights, and while sitting on the couch at home, he says. Posts are longer than 1,500 words, but shorter than 30,000 words. What's nice is that Armstrong also breaks these down into approximately how long it will take an average person to read them. So, for example, if you're interested in a 4,000-word article, it'll tell you that it'll probably take you about 16 minutes to read. And if 16 minutes is your subway commute, perfect. You can download the article and read it right there on the train. So they have this down to a science. And Armstrong is clearly not the only one who thinks the demand is there. Amazon recently announced their Kindle singles, electronic content between the size of short articles and long books, between 10,000 and 30,000 words. I'd like to reassert the Times' deep and enduring commitment to long-form narratives and the sometimes crazy, obsessed, manic-depressive work cycles they require from the people who create them. Isabel said she wanted us to talk a bit about what it takes out of writers to report and write these pieces. So why do we do them? You know the cycle I'm talking about. It really is manic depressive. Like, you get onto a topic, you begin reporting. You know, you can have setbacks during the reporting where you think the story isn't coming together, but basically it's an arc where towards the moment of publication, or for me it's always like right after I've written a lead that I really like, and you know this is working, it's going to make it into make it to publication and be done. And then the piece actually does come out, and you're hearing, all of us mainly hear from writer friends right away, that was great, or that was a great hit, and that's when your emotions are at their peak, and you're just on the high of a life. And really, like the next day, at least for me, I think a lot of my colleagues at the Times, that downward cycle starts. The manic and then the depressive, the downward trajectory begins. And at least, I know this was true of me when I was an investigative reporter. The low is when you tell yourself you're never going to find another subject again. You've written your last piece. So why on earth do we do this kind of work? I think the real reason at the end of the day is impact. These articles actually do change the world. And I'm going to describe today one body of recent work that did create real change. And I'm going to show you another which conveys the new shapes and presentations that the web offers us. My colleague at the Times, Alan Schwartz, has spent the last 4 years writing about the dangers of concussions on the football field, a subject that the NFL had been in total denial about. Before we began publishing Alan's in-depth articles about former players suffering from advanced dementia before the time they were even yet 50. One of his long pieces explored the reluctance of high school players to even admit they had been concussed, which included the tragic deaths of young people who refused to leave their field of dreams. When Alan began this body of work, he wasn't even on our staff full time. He was a stringer, but we brought him on staff so that he could continue developing this work. And he actually he was in the sports department, but because these pieces were so powerful, we plucked him out of sports to work directly for Glenn Cramon, who is an editor at the Times who only deals with long enterprise, long pieces of narrative nonfiction, lines of reporting that we think could be series and eventually, very high impact stories. So we took Alan out of the daily mix of sports coverage to really just drill down deeply on the subject of concussions. And the pieces that Alan began publishing, at first, the NFL was still in denial. But they really did, this by the second year, the NFL could no longer ignore this subject. Other publications began to follow Alan's lead and also explore the subject. And in the past year, the NFL has had to, create a fund to help former players and their families deal with the residual public health issue of concussions, and have forced an entirely new safety protocol for all of high school sports. It turns out that girls playing soccer and lacrosse had even more serious rates of concussion, and Alan also probed this subject in depth. Alan was actually a math major who had never studied journalism or writing, and he uses the precepts of calculus in structuring his pieces, relying on something actually called the golden ratio. He's figured out that B matter in a long story, by B matter I think all of you may know I'm talking about, the necessary background and history that you have to infuse a close-in story with. It's kind of what I would describe as the hard work for readers. And the golden ratio has taught Alan that the B matter should never come earlier than 45% of the way through a long story, and never further down than 65% of the way, when a reader will just give up if you put it towards the end. So I included that because I thought that is something practical that you long-form writer types can take away from this talk. Finally, I'd like to talk about the new face of long-form journalism at the Times, which I've tried to champion with Andrew Devagal, who leads our multimedia group. Andrew and I share a vision of what I call integrated storytelling, where photography, video, audio, and other features are not simply offshoots of written pieces, but are integral to the journalism from the inception of a project. I think we managed to pull this off successfully with a project we launched last year called A Year at War, which is run as a long series of articles over the last year. And in fact, the writer who's written all the stories, Jim Dow, is still working on them, and the last one is coming up. From the beginning, we saw the series as a way to re-engage our readership, depressed and bored by nearly a decade of war coverage in the lives of the American troops fighting in Afghanistan. Rather than focus on the fighting itself or the big strategic and political questions about the NATO mission, we want to look intimately at the troops themselves. We hope we could make readers feel, hear, and almost taste deployed life through long narratives, photos, and video, and to show in close to real time how war affects average soldiers, the heartache of leaving children and spouses, the anxiety of arriving in a combat zone, the fear of a first firefight, the wariness of working with Afghans, the pain of seeing mates hurt or killed, the dilemmas of leadership, the uncertainties and disorientation of returning home after a year away. After a few brainstorming sessions that Andrew and I had, and I'll explain this slide in a second, from folks from our photo, video, and multimedia unit, we arrived at our initial menu of stories. What this is basically the yellow line is the straight narrative arc that a printed story would usually follow. And the circles are opportunities that in multimedia storytelling, by offering extra features, a cast of characters, a sidebar story, you know sidebars from print pieces. You offer readers the opportunity, if they want, to leave the narrative and open one of those circles. And that's how we conceived of a year at war. So we decided, along with the narrative, we'd have long-form videos to accompany each print piece, on-camera interviews with soldiers before, during, after, and at the end of the deployment, slideshows of Damon Winter's photos. Damon won a Pulitzer in 2008 for his pictures of Barack Obama and began shooting video for the first time for the Year at War project. We also decided to feature the writings and photos of the soldiers themselves, which were amazing and wholly original and so different from what professional journalists write, but in the rawness and immediacy of their own writings, you really get to know the characters. Over the course of the year, we added other things to our interactive series website: panoramic photos, blog posts, and what we called moments, 10-second videos that Damon created capturing some uniquely odd, beautiful, or surprising aspect of deployed life. And we created soldier streams in which a reader, by clicking on that soldier's name, could enter a file filled with not just interviews, but also email messages, Facebook posts, and videos, organized chronologically to show the arc of that soldier's experience. This is probably the deepest and richest menu of content we have ever offered readers of a long series. While the written articles by Jim were powerful in their own right, the multimedia helped make the story of the troops feel fresh and so much more powerful, I think. So I'm going to end by showing you a video segment, just one. It's really just one of those circles, not even a main one. It's a video about a sergeant named Sergeant Eish, who was one of the soldiers who was deployed with the unit we followed very closely. The article tried to describe, with some Timesian sweep, the tribulations of military families, using the sergeant's poignant story as a case study. But it couldn't come close to matching the directness and emotion of the video. His boys, who you meet in what I'm about to show you, are so articulate, so compelling and appealing in their on-camera interviews, and it made the heartache of the separation that Sergeant Ike had with them apparent to even the most war-weary reader and viewer. And by zeroing in on one experience, the sergeant's home leave, the video freed the print piece to discuss broader issues. So I leave you with my optimism about the past, the present, and the future of this uniquely American art form that we all treasure. Since no good deed goes unpunished, Isabel can expect to get an invitation to come speak at Yale next year. I just taught my last class on Monday. I ended class with a reminder of our first reading, Gay's Frank Sinatra profile. My students are now writing their final papers, a piece of long-form journalism which is at least 5,000 words long. They've been struggling to get their reporting done. They've been coping with the manic-depressive cycle that I just described. And they've just about finished, all of them, writing their outlines. And as they marched out of the seminar room in Lindsley Chittenden Hall, where I teach and where the English department, the House of Hersey as I call it, is headquartered, they saw one phrase that I had written on the blackboard, one phrase written by their teacher. It was 3 words meant to encourage: Harlan Ellison's boots. Thank you.
It's pretty hard, and like wondering if he'll come back safe, or like worrying about him if he got hit or not. I hope he doesn't.
He said that he might come back different. Like no legs, like no arm and stuff.
Okay, hold this right here. I need to kick all the dirt off. Hold it right there.
I think about it like 10 or more times a day, like worrying about it. I'm thinking like, please like bring him back safe, and just worrying about him.
I only cried once at school. I usually cry at night.
Isaac and Joey's dad, Sergeant First Class Brian Eish, is deployed to Afghanistan. Their mom's not in their lives. After she and Brian got divorced, the courts took away her right to see them. So for a year, while their dad's at war, the boys are living with their uncle, aunt, and 3 cousins in central Wisconsin.
It was a lot worse than my wife and I thought it was going to be, just seeing what they have to deal with day to day with not having their dad.
Uncle Sean, can we go up here, Uncle Sean?
Come on, boy.
It was a lot more traumatic than I've ever pictured it for them. And it was for me, too.
For Isaac and Joey, their dad's deployment meant leaving their home in upstate New York. Like lots of military kids, they're used to moving around.
I don't like it when it puffs out.
But this time, they had to start a new life and a new school without the stability of their only parent.
It was kind of hard to move because I had to get all new friends. It was hard making friends. When I go to school, I don't try to get too attached to my friends because I move around a lot. And because when I leave, it's hard.
The deployment has been especially hard on Joey. Last school year, he got into some serious fights. One was so bad, the school called the police and suspended him.
We've had other children whose parents have been deployed, but the difference is that Joey was deployed too, from his home in New York, and had to come to an entirely different environment.
At the beginning of this whole school thing, it wasn't so good.
He had some anger pent up. He felt his dad was leaving him. We had long talks about, your dad has a job to do, and Joey had a hard time understanding that. And he took some of that anger out on other kids.
All right, up on the table and get it finished so that...
Can I get it on this table?
I have 3 kids of my own, and to bring 2 small kids into your household was a lot tougher than Lisa and I expected.
She does. I can learn about she does.
That's one good one.
A lot more energy around the house, and just getting them to sports is a lot rougher, and they take a lot of your time.
I try to think about other things than my dad being gone because it's a lot easier. I know that he's doing his job, and I really like that he's over there, but what I don't like is that I don't get to see him in person.
Finally, after 6 months in Afghanistan, Sergeant Aish is coming home on leave. He'll be back for 2 weeks.
I walked around the corner and I saw the boys. I saw my dad and my brother, and saw a lot more people than I was expecting. But then it was kind of like, drop to the knees and get tackled by 2 little boys that want to see their dad. So it was awesome.
When my dad left, I thought I didn't want him to go because just in case he got shot.
Did you miss me? I missed you.
Now I know he's going to make it through because he's already over halfway through.
When my dad was at Afghanistan, I felt like I had a 25-pound weight on my shoulders. And then when my dad came back, it was gone.
Oh, that's for me?
During his 2-week leave, Sergeant Aish and the boys are inseparable.
Go sit down and try mine, goofball. Stop freaking growing.
It was just back to normal with my dad.
You gotta loosen them up more. You got big feet.
It's gonna stink really bad, guys. You might want to plug your nose. Might want to plug your nose.
I felt like I couldn't say thank you to enough people.
It means a lot that you guys all came, showing up at the airport and coming to eat. I don't come around a lot, but I appreciate you guys supporting me. And Deb, you're in first place right now.
And we appreciate what you're doing.
Thanks.
Yes, we do.
We sat down and ate, and I just ordered my food, and it didn't even click. Hey, you got 2 kids to order for, but then I turned, and my brother Sean's ordering for him. So I kind of felt lost, like I'm their dad, dang it. And I was like, hey, thanks, I got to get back in the mode of doing this.
All right. Hey, you guys can get whatever haircut you want.
High and tight. Was on the back and sides and a little short on front.
They both want high and tights because Dad's home.
Dad. Like his on the sides.
Do you want to go to no guard? Do you have a no guard then?
They want to spend time with me. Lots. They're really clingy. They're battling between them for hugs. Who sits with me at lunch, who gets to sit up front in the truck.
Even though it means being away from his sons, Sergeant Aish is glad he's serving in Afghanistan. After almost 17 years in the Army, it's his first time in a war zone.
Honestly, what's my biggest fear? Having grandkids sitting on my lap. Oh, Grandpa, you were in the Army for 20 years. Did you ever go to war? No. But, I didn't want to go to Afghanistan just to say I went to Afghanistan either. It's kind of like I've been training for my job for 17 years. When am I going to get a chance to actually do my job? The deployment as far as the boys, I think it's topsy-turvy. I think with Joey, it's more of a, hey, Dad left me. So he's kind of feeling, does Dad love me? Did Dad abandon me? Whereas Isaac, I think it's better. Oh, hey, this is my dad, and he's really proud of me. Here we are. I leave tomorrow, and it's like, whoa, did I do everything I wanted to do? Did I spend enough time with my kids? I'm gauging all the room I got. Make sure I got enough room. When I first got to Afghanistan, what do you look forward to? You look forward to leave. You look forward to going home on leave, seeing your kids. Well, now I got to look forward to the end. It's like starting over.
Want to fix this stuff? It's kind of hard knowing that he's got 11 or 10 hours left with us.
You guys ready for bed? I've been prepping the boys all week. Come on, you got to be tough. It's almost over.
He said that he'll be alright, and don't worry about him. Just worry about you. My dad is the only one that I practically love the most right now.
Huh?
I get kind of worried about is anything can happen.
I know, Isaac, but anything can happen here. Anything can happen anywhere, okay? I got a lot of training. I know what I'm doing, okay? I'm not gonna purposely do anything stupid.
I know.
You gotta do it, okay? As soon as I get on that plane, the sooner you can stop crying, right?
Love you, Dad.
You guys go with Grandma and Grandpa, okay?
Okay.
I love you guys. I will.
Keep your chin up.
I question myself every day if I'm doing the right thing for my kids. Am I raising them right? I'm trying to, do my duty to my country and deploy, and do what Uncle Sam asks me to do. But, what's everybody asking my boys to do? What are they supposed to do?
How long did that take to produce, beginning to end?
That segment took, from beginning, because Aish, it's picked out as a character, to follow in the beginning. It was a couple of months, but in terms of knowing when he was making his home visit and doing the setup to establish the two boys as characters, it took probably about 2 months, I think, to put that together, is my recollection. And again, it's just one of, the narrative line with the bubbles. It's one, there are probably, 10 videos, and that isn't really a video. You experience, in a way, it's interesting. It seems like it's a video, but most of the images in it are slides. There are some moving pictures, and then, it's just the powerful audio with the slides. And I know that we did shoot some video at the airport when the sergeant is hugging his kids goodbye, and our videographer, who's a young woman, started weeping. I mean, it's true. I should have warned you. You needed the Kleenex. But, and her name is Sarah, and one of the sons saw her tear up, and on the audio, you can hear him saying, "Ooh, Dad, Sarah's having a really hard time getting the video done because she's crying." So, I mean, for all of the people, Damon Winter, who, he's taken the photograph, he went, over to Afghanistan and took pictures of the unit, in battle, getting, ready. They, went through some tough firefights, but, all of it is, he's taken the pictures for almost all of it. It's occupied him and Jim Dow, the main writer, for more than a year. It's been, the biggest. Andrew Devagal has a unit of about 8 people, I think, at the Times doing multimedia, and they handle everything from very rich offerings about elections to this kind of very close-in character portrait. But it's been a big project. It took all of last year, and a couple of the pieces have run this year. So, you need resources to do this kind of work. It's not every newsroom in the country that can do it. I think, while multimedia units are becoming popular, that, you have to, it takes money to have one, for sure. Yes.
Everyone is being taught everything, audio slideshows, photography, video, and so on. What is your experience from putting together a project like that in terms of, what kind of people did you bring together? And especially in this context, being a non-fiction conference, what does it mean for the writer on a project? Do you see a trend towards specialization or more a trend towards generalization?
The glory of the Times is that it has some of everything. I mean, we have on, the Metropolitan News desk or the National desk, we have, reporters who are still designated, their beat is GA, probably the most old-fashioned assignment anyone could have. GA is general assignment, which means they cover something different, every day or several times a day. So we have generalists, and then we have, incredibly specialized reporters too. And, what I am looking for, when I'm hiring someone isn't like a menu of like check it off. Like, for certain highly specialized digital jobs we are, but I'm looking for someone who seems to be, a passionate storyteller in the first place, who, loves to report, is curious, will go the extra mile. And a question I always ask goes beyond, whatever the specific job that I'm interviewing them for. And I always ask them, like, what may be next, or 5 years out, or 10 years out, they might want to do, because I'm wary of hiring people who are only narrow specialists. Sure, to do that kind of work, you need people who are very experienced in production. We had people on our team, developers who are really more engineers than journalists, to figure out how to build. We built a mini site within our site to contain all of this rich narrative journalism. So it's tough. I think journalism schools have a hard time preparing their graduates for the brave new world of journalism. And I think I can see the sense of wanting students to get a taste and come out of journalism school with a variety of experience sets. But I worry that sometimes detracts from, just the general old school values that make people into uniquely powerful storytellers. Goes beyond specialization.
We are talking about the fine line of things that are non-fictional that become fictional, like also journalists stage events in order to create new reality and new narrative. Like we have James Frey, Jason Blair, and so on. And the question is, how do you handle
How do you
such
protect against that
yeah.
kind of thing?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the Jason Blair episode that you referred to was certainly an extremely painful part of the Times' recent history. For those of you who may not remember, it was a journalist who both plagiarized and fabricated stories, claimed to have interviewed people that he never even went and met with, and you know, the Times fired him and did a big study about how this could happen. We published, I think one of the longest pieces we've published recently was an investigation of how that had happened. And, you know, what we did, I'm not saying, you know, it's, you know, I always, any top editor of a very respected publication like the Times, like, worries about something like that happening. But we did take certain, I think, very sensible safeguards after Jason Blair. The Times had never had an ombudsman, or we call it the public editor, and we appointed one for the first time. And it was because actually some members of the public had alerted the Times to Jason not having interviewed. They'd tried to call and say, basically to the Times senior management at that time, which were different top editors, like, Houston, you have a problem. And they were kind of ignored, or were not connected to the right people. And so we thought it made sense to actually have an editor at the Times who doesn't report to me or to Bill Keller, who's independent, who the public can call directly when they suspect a piece of journalism has been corrupted in some way and want to look into. So we established that. We appointed on our masthead a standards editor to be much tougher on things like conflict of interest rules and other internal procedures. And, you know, we just took a very tough and thorough look at ourselves. And at the end of the day, what you expect from a first-class news organization after something like that is transparency, honesty, and a willingness to take new procedures that will protect against that happening again. And that's what we did. But, you know, you're right that throughout the field of writing, it seems every year there's a scandal of some kind, and it's extremely regrettable. But I don't think, you know, all of the attention that those get should detract from the reality that there are many, many more writers playing by the rules. And as you said about North Africa right now, or Afghanistan, are risking their lives to do honest reporting and witness and simply bring the story before the public. It is, I think, at root, a very honest and noble profession, despite these lapses.
How do you feel this this recent project, the Year at War, was received with the multimedia? I mean, it's hard to gauge when you're starting how, if people are going to react to it.
I mean, the only measure that we really have beyond, you know, getting direct good feedback is the traffic, and the traffic has been quite good. And every time there's a new edition, like Jim has a new piece coming, which is, and you know, now the unit is completely home. They've been home for a couple of months, and it's a story about the difficult adjustment to home. You know, when that goes up, you know, it will lift traffic again, and people go back and they look at some of the past portions of the project too. But, you know, a frustration, something I'm working on right now at the Times is, like, you publish these things, they take so much work, and they're really only on the homepage of our website for, you know, a full day if they're lucky. And then, they're a little bit hard to find. Obviously, they still are searchable on nytimes.com, but they're not prominent. They've been overtaken by the next day's news and the day after that. So I'm trying to see if, because we have so much fantastic long form content, whether it's this or the Dan Barry piece that Isabel was talking about, whether there's a way on our site to make a very attractive library of long reads, replenish them every so often, but don't view that on a daily, like the rest of daily journalism. And basically, the Times could end up having a long reads of its own. And I hope we're gonna do that. I don't think it's that difficult to do it, but that's another way to keep the audience a little bit more robust and not pour all of the sweat equity that this takes, have it go up and then kind of disappear. It's one of the conundrums of the long form in journalism. Anyway, thanks again.